Step 4. Made a fearless and searching moral inventory of ourselves. Recall that we know the truth by converting back to the phantasm, the process where the intellect compares the abstraction it contains to the phantasm in the imagination to determine if the abstraction is founded in reality. Now, self-knowledge is fundamentally different from other forms of knowledge because it proceeds by reflection. In every other form of knowledge, the known and the knower are distinct. But in knowing oneself, the intellect turns back on itself, and the known and the knower are one. The process of converting back to the phantasm also applies to self-knowledge, where we can compare our self-concept, our intellectual abstraction, to our self-image, the image in the phantasm. As I have previously stated, this process is prone to error, as the abstraction is only as true as the image in the phantasm, and the lower faculties can distort the image in the phantasm, which result in a distorted abstraction. Error enters into the intellect in a variety of ways, not all of which are the fault of the subject. But I believe alcoholism begins with self-deception. This is when one willingly alters the self-concept and self-image to suit a movement of the sensitive appetites, of the emotions. This distortion in our understanding of ourselves is called egoism. And in my opinion, the emotion that drives egoism is fear. Error enters into the intellect by the judgment, making false associations about oneself. What this is different for everybody, but I believe that an error I think to many applies is, I am entitled to happiness. This statement is a reaction to fear of our vulnerability and our dependence on others and God. An ancient Greek saying is that vice is blind to itself. This is because vice acts contrary to nature, so it damages the operation of the intellect and therefore causes blindness. So, because the initial act of self-deception based on fear acts contrary to nature and truth, it damages the intellect and causes blindness. Most importantly and profoundly, it causes blindness to self. I say it is profound because our understanding of the world and our actions in this world proceed from knowledge of ourself. If one is blind at the basic knowledge of himself, all the actions that rationally proceed from that error will also be blind too. A mathematician looks at the world through the eyes of a mathematician. A lawyer looks at the world through the eyes of the law. If one is distorted in his understanding of himself, his entire understanding of the world will be distorted. Blindness, I believe, is more a problem than character defects themselves. Everybody knows what is right and wrong. We behave terribly because we are blind, and that blindness maintains our problem. Our effort to change outside the steps are futile because of blindness. Because we know ourselves through reflection, where the known and the knower are one, if there is blindness in the intellect, it is impossible to free oneself through one's own effort. It is like a broken wrench fixing itself. In order to come to genuine knowledge of self, one needs God's help and a regimented method of introspection. In the process of addiction, the higher faculties, the intellect and the will, are damaged and habituated to vice. Because our life is run and governed by our higher faculties, if they are habituated to vice, your entire life will be disordered. Therefore, recovery must rectify the higher faculties. The will is rectified in the ninth step, and the intellect is rectified in the fourth step. How do we rectify the intellect? By the truth. How does one find the truth? By self-sacrifice. There is no other way. The egoist thinks he is enlarged by protecting what he has and appropriation of what he doesn't have. But a man can only be truly enlarged by service to something greater than himself, by self-sacrifice. The truth can only be encountered when it is recognized as greater than our desires and fears. This rectifies the intellect surer than anything. Once the necessity of self-sacrifice is understood, we can understand the role of fear and the necessity for fortitude in finding the truth. The big book says in reference to the steps that we must be fearless from the very beginning. I interpret this to mean that all of the steps have a relationship to fear. But the fourth step states explicitly we must be fearless. Therefore, the fourth step is especially frightening. Why is self-knowledge so frightening? This is profound, and I don't think I am able to penetrate to the heart of the matter, but I believe there are several reasons. First is because the root problem of alcoholism is fear. The big book states that selfishness, self-centeredness, and egoism are the root of our problem, and I believe the root of egoism is fear, as I have stated. We are hardwired to seek happiness, yet we are not guaranteed happiness. We are not entitled to happiness. This leaves man profoundly vulnerable to the depths of his heart. The natural reaction to this vulnerability is fear, and fear leads to self-deception and egoism. Another reason that the truth about oneself is so frightening is that when we act contrary to nature, we damage our entire soul. We damage our intellect and will. We also damage the order in our emotions. Recall that our emotions are divided into concupiscible and irascible appetites, and that our irascible appetites deal with the emotions of fear, hope, and despair. When we act contrary to nature, we damage the balance of the irascible appetite. The consequence of this is fear and cowardice. And because the object of this act of excuse me, and because the object of this act contrary to nature is the self, egoism, and the object of cowardice then the object of cowardice is the self. This disorder in the appetites in their extreme manifests itself as obsession. In walking through fear, the addict puts his appetites in order and thus frees himself from obsession. It is the fearlessness of the fourth step that causes recovery as much as the knowledge gained. The brave man is not free to fear. Instead, he confronts the source of his fear for the sake of a greater good. This is the definition of fortitude. There is a paradox contained in fortitude that is expressed in sacred scripture. If you love your life, you will lose it. But if you lose your life for my sake, you will find it. When we sacrifice ourselves for a greater good, we effect an internal integrity and intactness that would be impossible any other way. And the greater good of the fourth step is the truth. As I have said, according to Aristotle, the ultimate purpose of man's life is happiness, and happiness is found in the use of right reason, which is virtue. The purpose of virtue is to effect happiness. Therefore, facing his fears in the fourth step, the addict begins to experience happiness. There is an irony in alcoholism. The addict who grasps at happiness motivated by fear loses happiness in his very grasping. A life motivated and dominated by fear cannot be happy. But as a man pursues the truth despite himself, he sets himself in order and is able to achieve happiness. Fortitude doesn't stand alone as a virtue. One doesn't sacrifice oneself for the sake of sacrifice alone, but for the greater good. Therefore, fortitude is not dependent on the knowledge and realization of the greater good. For the addict, this is the truth. It is through the virtue of prudence and justice that we understand and realize the greater good. Fortitude presupposes prudence and justice. And without justice and prudence, there is no fortitude. As I have said, prudence is the eye of every virtue, and no virtue is blind. Blindly risking oneself without thought is not brave. Fortitude must involve a right estimation of things, of the value of the good to be gained, and the value of what is to be sacrificed. The brave man is in touch with reality. It is prudence that orders the mind to reality. The good of reason is actualized by justice first. Fortitude is dependent on justice. One can only be brave for a just cause. Justice governs all our actions. When someone acts bravely, the internal act of overcoming fear is fortitude, but the brave act itself is an act of justice. Justice is obedience to the law. The search for the truth is righteous because it is in conformity with the natural law. Fortitude realizes the good because it is the manifestation of justice in the realm of fear. This is why fortitude rectifies the human person, because it is just. I would like to continue my analysis of the fourth step with a riddle. From my grasp, no man will ever escape. I am the greatest of allies, and I am the deadliest of enemies. I raise men up as kings and cast them down as paupers. Feast or famine, honor or shame, I dispense with equal regard. Good or evil, and the fruits that bear mean nothing to me. Apart from me, no man will ever live. I serve unfailingly, even to crush those I serve. I serve easily and well all who would master me. In the passing of 28 days I may be ruled. I work with tireless persistence and do not waver. From birth to death and beyond I shall walk with you. By my fervent vigil your fate will be written. Cast you up or cast you down, I shall act upon your will. You need only be firm with me to tame me to your hand. Hero or coward, fair or foul, call me to your service. To name me is the beginning. The answer to this riddle is habit. It is our habits that empower us or hamstring us. All that we do or say or perceive in this world is governed by habits. The question, who am I, is answered by, what are my habits? Our habits define our life, and we can only gain true self-knowledge by knowledge of our habits. Blindness to the habits that govern your life is blindness indeed. Therefore, if the psychic change is to be a profound change of the human person, it must involve a change in our habits. Our habits of perception and action. One can only make a change out of what one is aware of. Therefore, recovery must involve introspection around our habits. What is a more significant statement? I am a doctor. I make $500,000 a year. I go to the gym every day. I cheat on my wife. It is our moral habits, our virtues and vices that is the most significant part of us. It is in our moral life that the question, who am I, is truly answered. Our moral habits are the substance of our life. Everything else is an accident. The principal truth that defines the nature of a habit is its relationship to the natural. A habit is good if it conforms to the natural law, if it perfects our nature and fulfills our purpose. A habit is bad because it operates against nature. It distorts our nature. It is because of this that there are no neutral habits. They either act with or against our nature. Because the problem that afflicts the addict reaches to the very core of his heart, then if a psychic change is to be effective, it must necessarily involve a moral change, a change in our moral habits. The big book states that lack of power is our dilemma. It also states that we must be free of the bondage of self. So, at the core of the issue of alcoholism is the issue of freedom and power. The issue of freedom cannot be understood outside the issue of God and human morality and the free will. God is the author of free will and our moral nature. He made man free so he could choose what is right. When one acts according to his nature, he frees himself. When he acts contrary to his nature, he loses his freedom and enslaves himself. Lack of freedom can only be understood as some impediment of the will, and power can be understood as the manifestation of the will. If I am unjustly incarcerated, my freedom is taken away, my will is impeded, but I still remain free as a moral agent. The most infamous form of incarceration is bondage to self, which is will being bound from choosing the right by fear and selfishness and injustice. In other words, vice. If slavery and weakness is found in vice, then freedom and power is found in virtue. The purpose of the free will is to choose what is right. Therefore, virtue is the ultimate manifestation of freedom and power. Virtue empowers us. Power can be understood as the freedom to find your final end. If one is impeded from filling their final end, they lack power. There are many types of power in this world. For example, a senator may have political power, or a martial artist may have the ability to fight. But what is the point in having power in this world is if one is impotent in the ability to find his final end. Nothing empowers man like virtue, for it is through virtue that we meet our final end.